My name is Lillian Price. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with soft words: steady, agreeable, low maintenance. I work in a field where reliability matters more than visibility, and I've always been comfortable letting others take the spotlight while I handled what needed to be done. That comfort, I've learned, is often misunderstood. People tend to underestimate me, not in a dramatic way. No one ever said I wasn't capable. It was quieter than that. They assumed I wouldn't push back, that I'd smooth things over, that if something felt off, I'd swallow it for the sake of harmony. I looked like someone who would rather keep the peace than claim space, and for a long time, that assumption worked in everyone else's favor. This story isn't about rage or revenge, it's about awareness. It's about what happens when disrespect is small enough to be excused, public enough to sting, and repeated enough to become a pattern. The moment most people remember, my in-laws criticized me during our wedding reception in front of everyone, wasn't the beginning. It was simply the first time the truth had an audience. What you'll hear isn't a dramatic takedown or a cathartic shouting match. There are no villains twirling here, no sudden twists of luck. Instead, this is a documentary-style walkthrough of how quiet dominance forms, not by force, but by clarity, by watching, by choosing when silence is protection and when it becomes power. I want to be clear about something early on. I loved my husband. I believed in family. I entered that marriage genuinely wanting unity, respect, and shared ground. When I say respect, should have started on day one. I don't mean that as a threat or a warning. I mean it as an observation I learned too late and then never forgot. This story moves slowly on purpose. You'll feel moments where nothing seems to happen, where I stay quiet when you might expect a response. That's intentional, because real emotional shifts don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive as a small internal decision. I see this now. As the story unfolds, you'll notice a change, not in how loudly I speak, but in how carefully I listen. You'll see how people react when the person they assumed would always absorb the impact quietly stops doing so. And you'll understand why. By the time anyone realized what had changed, there was nothing left to argue about. I'm telling this honestly, without exaggeration, and without asking you to take sides. My hope isn't to entertain you with drama, but to offer recognition, especially if you've ever been in a room where you felt present but unseen. Before we go further, let me ask you this gently. Have you ever looked back at a moment you brushed off, only to realize later it was trying to tell you something important? To my in-laws, I was never a mystery. I was a category. From the beginning, they seemed to understand me as someone of little importance. I was the woman their son loved, yes, but more importantly, I was the woman who would adapt, the one who would fit into existing traditions without needing them adjusted. I was polite, punctual, and grateful. I asked questions instead of making statements. I listened more than I spoke. And because of that, they felt comfortable deciding who I was before I had finished my first full sentence. At family gatherings, I was introduced with efficiency rather than warmth. My job was summarized quickly, without curiosity. My opinions were acknowledged with nods that didn't invite follow-up. If I spoke and someone interrupted me, the conversation simply continued. No one circled back. No one noticed, including me at first. I don't say that with self-pity. I genuinely believed this was normal. I had grown up learning that harmony was built by minimizing friction, that being easy to be around was a form of kindness. So when I noticed the subtle hierarchy, who was deferred to, whose stories were retold, whose preferences shaped decisions, I adjusted myself accordingly. They didn't treat me poorly. That's important to say. They just didn't treat me as central. When plans were made, I was informed, not consulted. When jokes were told, I was the audience, not the subject. Compliments, when they came, were about how understanding I was, how low maintenance, how lucky their son was to have someone who didn't make things complicated. Those words were meant kindly. I know that now. But they also carried an unspoken expectation. Stay this way. In photos, I stood slightly to the side. In conversations, I filled pauses when needed. I remembered birthdays, dietary restrictions, and preferred seating arrangements. I made mental notes about who disliked confrontation and who thrived on it. I became useful in ways that made the group function smoothly, without ever becoming someone whose absence would disrupt it. What's strange is that invisibility doesn't feel like a warning at first. It feels like safety. No one was watching me closely, which meant no one was challenging me. I could exist without scrutiny, without pressure to perform. And because I didn't demand recognition, no one felt threatened by me. I was trusted with tasks, but not with influence. Included, but never centered. My husband didn't see it. Or maybe he did, but not fully. To him, I was steady. A relief. Someone who didn't escalate tensions, who didn't take things personally. He was proud of how well I fit in, how little friction there was between his family and me. When he said things like, "They really like you," I believed him. Because in his mind, liking meant no conflict. I told myself stories to make it all reasonable. They're just strong personalities. They've known each other longer. I'm still new. Respect takes time. I'll earn my place by being consistent. And I was consistent, unfailingly so. What I didn't realize then was that consistency, without boundaries, teaches people exactly how little they have to give in return. Every time I adjusted myself quietly, the adjustment became invisible. Every time I let something slide, it rewrote the baseline of what was acceptable. To them, I was a dependable background, emotional infrastructure, the kind of person you only notice when something goes wrong, but nothing ever did because I made sure of it. I didn't know yet that roles, once assigned, are rarely questioned unless someone refuses to keep playing them. At that point in my life, I wasn't refusing anything. I was simply being who I had always been. Attentive, calm, unassuming. I didn't think of it as disappearing. I thought of it as contributing. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my place already was. Not because anyone announced it, but because everyone behaved as if it were obvious. And the truth is, I accepted that version of myself too. The first moment I remember wasn't loud. That's why it stayed with me. It happened months before the wedding, during a family dinner that felt comfortably routine. We were seated around a long table, plates half cleared, conversation drifting in the lazy way it does when people feel safe with one another. I was listening more than speaking as usual, letting the rhythm of their voices wash over me. Someone asked about the wedding planning. It wasn't directed at me. My mother-in-law answered first. She spoke about the venue choice, how they had suggested it early on, how practical it was, how it suited the family. She talked about the guest list, the menu, and the timing. All the decisions I had been part of. Some I had initiated. I waited for the natural pause where I might add something. It never came. Then she smiled in my direction, almost as an afterthought, and said, "Lillian's been very flexible. She's letting us handle most of it." The table hummed with approval. Flexible, easy, good-natured. I smiled too, automatically. There was nothing offensive in her words. That's what made them sharp. Because they rewrote the story of my involvement in a way that erased intention. I hadn't let them handle anything. We had discussed. We had agreed. But the version presented made me sound like a bystander to my own wedding. Pleasantly detached, generously uninvolved. No one corrected it. Not my husband, not me. The conversation moved on, but something had already shifted inside my chest. Not anger, something quieter. A thin awareness, like realizing you've been slightly misnamed and deciding whether it's worth correcting. I told myself it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. The wedding would happen. Everyone was happy. Why interrupt a good mood over phrasing? That was the rationalization. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to seem difficult. Later that evening, as we helped clear the table, my sister-in-law joked about how chill I was compared to other brides. "You're not one of those girls who need control," she said, smiling as if it were a compliment. I laughed lightly. I didn't ask what kind of girl needs control. I didn't say that wanting a voice in your own life isn't the same as being demanding. I let the moment pass. That's what made it a cut instead of a wound, small enough to ignore, sharp enough to remember. From then on, similar moments appeared with increasing familiarity. My preferences were summarized instead of asked for. My opinions were acknowledged, but not integrated. When I did speak up, someone else would rephrase what I said, slightly off, and receive the credit for clarity. Each time, I told myself the same thing. It's not intentional. They don't mean it that way. This is just how families work. And maybe it was. But something about the pattern unsettled me. Not because it hurt, but because it taught. It taught them that they could define me without resistance, that my silence meant agreement, that my calmness meant consent. What stayed with me most wasn't what they said. It was how easy it was for everyone to move past it, how quickly the moment dissolved into laughter and dessert, how invisible my internal pause was. That night, lying next to my husband, I considered mentioning it. I even rehearsed the sentence in my head, something light, casual. Hey, did you notice earlier when... But I stopped myself. It felt too small to explain without sounding petty. And I didn't want to be the person who dissected harmless comments. I wanted to be reasonable, so I stayed quiet. Again. I didn't know then that silence, when repeated, doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It becomes data. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. But it marked a place where I learned something important. If I didn't define myself clearly, someone else would do it for me, kindly, efficiently, and without asking. And once that definition was accepted by the room, changing it would require more than a correction. It would require a shift in expectation. At the time, I wasn't ready for that. I still believed goodwill would naturally lead to respect. I still thought patience was enough. I would learn slowly that patience without boundaries teaches people exactly how far they can go. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, it had already been normalized. That's the quiet danger of subtle disrespect. It doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as a tone, a rhythm, a series of moments that individually don't justify confrontation but collectively reshape how you're treated. After that first dinner, similar instances became almost predictable. Not frequent enough to alarm me, just consistent enough to establish expectation. When family decisions were discussed, I was often the last to be informed. When opinions were shared, mine were met with polite acknowledgement and then gently bypassed. Sometimes someone would say, "Lillian doesn't mind," before I had spoken. And more often than not, they were right. Because by then, I had learned that pushing back required energy I wasn't sure I was allowed to spend. I started to notice how often my agreement was assumed rather than requested. If we were choosing holiday plans, someone would turn to me and say, "You're fine with whatever, right?" The question wasn't an invitation. It was a summary of who they believed I was. And every time I nodded, I reinforced it. The strange part is how logical it all felt in the moment. I had reasons for everything. They're older. They've done this before. It's not worth creating tension. This is just one decision. Each rationalization made sense. Each one was small, but together they formed a habit, both for them and for me. I became the person who absorbed inconvenience gracefully. If seating arrangements changed at the last minute, I adjusted. If plans ran late, I smiled. If a comment landed awkwardly, I smoothed it over with humor. People began to rely on that steadiness. It made them comfortable. And comfort, I learned, can be mistaken for entitlement. No one was cruel. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no insults, no obvious power plays. The disrespect was subtle enough to wear the mask of familiarity. Jokes framed as observations, decisions framed as assumptions, praise framed in ways that kept me small. "You're so easy," they'd say. "You don't take things personally. You're not like other women who get offended." Each sentence carried an implication. Stay agreeable, stay unbothered, stay in your lane. And I did. Because part of me believed that being unproblematic was a form of strength, that emotional maturity meant not reacting, that if I remained calm long enough, respect would eventually follow. What I didn't see yet was that respect isn't something people gradually give to those who wait patiently. It's something they offer or withhold based on how clearly someone values themselves. My husband still didn't see it. Or maybe he saw fragments, but not the accumulation. To him, these were non-issues. He came from a family where teasing was affection, where opinions were shared loudly, and where the most assertive voice naturally guided the group. He interpreted my quiet as comfort, not concession. And I didn't correct him, because explaining it felt like translating a language he didn't speak. How do you describe 1,000 paper cuts when none of them break the skin? Instead, I adapted further. I spoke less in group settings. I chose my words carefully when I did speak. I framed suggestions as questions. I learned which topics to avoid entirely. I told myself I was being strategic, that this was temporary, that after the wedding, after things settled, the dynamics would even out. But something inside me was keeping score. not in a resentful way, more like an internal ledger. I remembered who listened and who didn't, who asked and who assumed, who spoke for me and who spoke with me. I noticed how easily my contributions were forgotten once they were no longer needed, how quickly my presence faded into the background as soon as I stopped facilitating, and still I stayed quiet. Because at that stage, silence felt safer than disruption. It felt like control. It felt like dignity. I didn't realize yet that by normalizing the way I was treated, I was helping to cement it. That every unchallenged moment was teaching the room what they could expect from me. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently for you to agree with it. And for a long time I did, without ever saying the words. Roles are rarely assigned out loud. They emerge quietly, through repetition, until everyone behaves as if they were agreed upon. By the time I understood the role I'd been given, I was already performing it flawlessly. In my husband's family, each person had a place. There was the organizer, the storyteller, the decision maker, the emotional center. And then there was me, the stabilizer, the one who filled gaps, the one who made transitions smooth and discomfort brief. I wasn't asked to take on this role. It was simply assumed, and I accepted it without protest because it felt familiar. I'd played similar parts before, in workplaces, in friendships, even in my own family. Be reliable. Be calm. Don't demand. The problem with being reliable is that people begin to rely on you without considering your limits. I noticed it in the smallest things. I was expected to help set up and clean up, even when no one asked. If there was confusion, eyes turned to me, not for leadership, but for resolution. I became the person who quietly handled logistics while others handled opinions. When conversations grew tense, someone would glance at me as if my presence alone might soften the mood. I was used as a buffer, a kind of emotional insulation that kept things comfortable for everyone else. And I complied, because saying no felt unnecessary, because it felt easier to manage things than to explain why I didn't want to. What I didn't see at first was how this role limited me. I wasn't invited into decision-making spaces because my value had been defined elsewhere. I was appreciated for my flexibility, not my perspective. For my availability, not my authority. When I did express a preference, it was often reframed as a suggestion rather than a stance. Lillian thinks maybe, someone would say, even when I had been clear. My certainty was softened for group consumption. Over time, I began to internalize the role myself. I stopped expecting to be consulted. I anticipated needs instead of voicing my own. I measured my success by how smoothly things went, not by whether I felt seen. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being useful. It doesn't feel like neglect, it feels like purpose. And that's why it's so easy to stay. My husband benefited from this dynamic, even if he didn't realize it. Life with me was easy. I handled details. I remembered things. I absorbed tension. When his family praised how well I fit in, he took it as a compliment to both of us. I didn't correct him, because on the surface, everything was working. But underneath, something was shifting. I started to notice how little room there was for me to change. How any deviation from the role, any moment of hesitation or disagreement, was met with surprise. Not anger, just confusion. As if I were stepping out of character. That's when it became clear. I wasn't just being perceived a certain way. I was being relied on to stay that way. The system worked because I made it work. And systems don't like disruption. I began to understand that if I ever wanted to be treated differently, I would first have to stop being so convenient. That respect in this context wasn't going to arrive as a reward for endurance. It would require a shift in how I showed up, or didn't. At that stage, I wasn't ready to make that shift publicly. But internally, the awareness had landed. I could see the structure now, the expectations, the invisible lines I was never meant to cross. And once you see a role clearly, it becomes very difficult to keep playing it unconsciously. I didn't feel angry. I felt alert. Because for the first time, I understood that the version of me they were comfortable with wasn't the full version of me. It was a function. And functions, once they stop serving, are quietly replaced. That realization stayed with me as the wedding approached, as expectations increased, as my usefulness became more visible, and my voice less so. I didn't know yet how or when things would change, But I knew something important had already shifted. I had stopped confusing my role with my worth. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened in a moment so quiet that no one else noticed it at all. It was a weekday afternoon, the kind that feels suspended between obligations. I'd taken a few hours off work to finalize some last wedding details, confirmations, emails, schedules. I was sitting alone at the small desk in our apartment, a cup of tea going cold beside me, my notebook open. I remember pausing mid-sentence, pen hovering above the page, because something felt off. I had just received a message from my mother-in-law. It was polite, efficient. She had updated me on a change to the reception schedule. Not asked, updated. The phrasing was careful, almost considerate, but the assumption was clear. The decision had already been made. Normally, I would have acknowledged it and adjusted. That was my role. Instead, I reread the message slowly. Not to find fault, but to understand why my chest felt tight. And in that moment, something clicked. I realized I wasn't upset about the change itself. I was upset about the pattern, about how often decisions about my life were being communicated to me after the fact, about how rarely anyone paused to ask what I thought before moving forward. I leaned back in my chair and did something I hadn't done before. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, not as a tactic. I simply stopped. I let the message sit. I let the silence stretch. And as I did, I noticed how unfamiliar it felt. How quickly my mind rushed to justify replying. They'll think I'm annoyed. They'll worry something's wrong. It's rude to leave messages unanswered. But underneath that urgency was something else. A question I had never asked myself before. Why is it my responsibility to immediately smooth over decisions I wasn't included in? That question didn't accuse anyone. It didn't demand action. It simply existed. And once it did, I couldn't ignore it. I looked back through my notebook. Pages of lists, timelines, reminders, evidence of how much I had carried quietly, how often I had adapted, how consistently I had made things easier for everyone else. And for the first time, I felt a shift in loyalty. Not away from my husband, not away from the family, but toward myself. It wasn't dramatic. There was no anger, just a calm recognition that something was unbalanced and that I had been compensating for it alone. I replied to the message eventually, politely, briefly, without over-explaining. I didn't apologize. I didn't add reassurance. I simply acknowledged the update. The world didn't end. No one followed up. No one seemed distressed. And that, more than anything, told me something important. The urgency I felt had been internal, not required. That afternoon, I took a walk. No music, no distractions, just space. I thought about how often I had confused being accommodating with being respected. I had believed that patience would naturally be rewarded, how I had waited for someone to notice my restraint and meet it with care. What I understood then was simple and unsettling. People don't adjust their behavior because you endure it gracefully. They adjust when the environment changes. And I was part of that environment. That day, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't make a decision that anyone else could see. But internally, something irreversible had begun. I stopped interpreting discomfort as something to immediately resolve. I started treating it as information. I began to notice my own reactions without judging them. There was a slight tightening when assumptions were made. The mental fatigue after group interactions. The quiet relief I felt when I didn't rush to fix things. Those sensations had always been there. I just hadn't listened to them. From that point on, silence wasn't just a habit. It became a choice. And choices, even small ones, have weight. By the time I returned home that evening, nothing had changed on the surface. The wedding plans were still moving forward. The family dynamics were intact. But the version of me who automatically absorbed imbalance was gone. In her place was someone observant, someone patient, but no longer passive. Someone who understood that respect doesn't begin when you demand it. It begins when you stop betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. I didn't know yet where that realization would lead. I only knew that I would not unsee it. Once silence became a choice, everything sounded different. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions out loud. On the surface, I remained exactly as I had been, polite, present, cooperative. But internally, the way I engaged shifted. I stopped volunteering explanations. When plans were discussed and my opinion wasn't requested, I didn't rush to insert it. When decisions were communicated rather than discussed, I acknowledged them without cushioning the impact. No added reassurance. No emotional labor to make others feel comfortable about excluding me. At first, no one noticed. That was the point. People are accustomed to patterns, not intentions. As long as the surface remains familiar, they assume nothing has changed underneath. And for a while, the system continued to run as it always had, just with slightly less fuel. I noticed how often people expected me to fill in gaps, to smooth transitions, to anticipate needs. And I noticed what happened when I didn't. Small pauses appeared in conversations, awkward moments where someone realized they'd spoken for me without checking. Logistics took longer to resolve. Tension lingered instead of being quietly absorbed. Nothing broke, but things weren't as seamless. And that discomfort didn't land on me anymore. That was the difference. My silence was no longer self-erasure. It was an observation. When my mother-in-law made a comment about how easygoing I was, I smiled without agreeing. When someone assumed I'd handle a task, I waited for them to ask. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Each interaction became data. I watched who adapted and who didn't, who noticed the shift and who relied on inertia, who respected the pause and who tried to rush past it. What surprised me most was how quickly silence was misinterpreted. They didn't think I was setting boundaries. They thought I was tired, distracted, busy. Some assumed I was stressed about the wedding. Others assumed I was still the same, just temporarily less available. No one considered that I might be choosing this. And that told me something important. They weren't paying attention to me as a person. They were paying attention to my function. I didn't correct that assumption either. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was trying to understand. I noticed how my husband reacted. At first, he didn't. He was used to me handling things quietly, and when I didn't, he filled in the gaps, temporarily. He asked a few questions. I answered honestly, without complaint. "I'm just stepping back a bit," I said once. Not defensively, just factually. He accepted that explanation easily, which, again, told me something. My constant presence had been expected, but not deeply examined. As the wedding drew closer, the pressure increased. More opinions, more last-minute changes, more opportunities for me to resume my old role. I didn't. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just consistently. Silence, used this way, is uncomfortable for people who are used to easy access. It forces them to sit with their own assumptions. It exposes how much they relied on what you provided without acknowledging it. And yet, no one confronted me, because there was nothing to confront. I wasn't refusing, I wasn't disagreeing, I wasn't making demands. I was simply no longer compensating. That distinction matters. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It creates space and waits to see who respects it. In those weeks, I learned more about my in-laws than I had in the entire year before. I saw who valued efficiency over inclusion, who prioritized tradition over consent, who confused calmness with compliance. And I learned something about myself too. I learned that my voice didn't need to be loud to be firm, that presence doesn't require constant participation, that silence, when chosen consciously, can be more revealing than any argument. By the time the wedding day approached, the dynamics had already shifted, subtly, invisibly. The foundation was no longer reinforced by my quiet labor. They just didn't know it yet, and neither did I know how far this shift would go. I only knew that I would not return to who I had been before. Because once silence becomes a choice, it stops being something others can take from you. What they never noticed was that while I was quiet, I was paying attention. Not out in a suspicious way, not with resentment, with clarity. When you stop performing a role, you gain time, mental space, energy that was previously spent on smoothing, adjusting, and compensating. That space has to go somewhere. For me, it went into observation. I began to see the structure beneath the interactions. I noticed who made decisions and who merely announced them, who spoke with authority and who borrowed it, who relied on tradition as justification, and who relied on others to absorb the consequences. I noticed how often my name was used as shorthand. Lillian's fine with it. Lillian doesn't mind. Lillian will understand. Each sentence revealed more than it intended to. I also began to notice inconsistencies, small ones, but meaningful. Stories that changed slightly depending on who was present. Financial assumptions that were made casually, without confirmation. emotional narratives that position certain people as generous and others as demanding, regardless of facts. I didn't challenge any of it. Instead, I documented, not formally at first, just mental notes, patterns, timing, language, who said what and when, who followed up and who didn't, who benefited from decisions framed as for everyone, and who quietly adjusted around them. I realized something unsettling. The system depended on people like me staying unrecorded. As long as I remained invisible, there was no counterbalance, no memory, no alternative account. The story belonged to whoever told it most confidently. So I started writing things down, not to use against anyone, not as evidence, simply as a record. Dates, conversations, decisions, not emotional reactions, just facts. I kept it neutral, almost boring. And the act of writing changed how I felt. It grounded me. It reminded me that my experience was real, even if it wasn't acknowledged. That clarity didn't require validation. At the same time, I quietly strengthened areas of my life that had nothing to do with the wedding. I reviewed our finances, not out of fear, but responsibility. I made sure I understood every account, every shared obligation, every document I had previously trusted others to manage. I didn't accuse. I didn't assume wrongdoing. I simply made sure I knew where I stood. Knowledge is a form of calm. I also stopped oversharing emotionally. When asked how I was feeling, I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't process out loud. I didn't invite interpretation. That confused some people. They were used to my openness, my willingness to explain myself, my habit of softening my own boundaries so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable crossing them. Without that access, they had less to work with. What they didn't notice was that I wasn't withdrawing. I was consolidating. I was becoming precise. I noticed how often family was invoked selectively, how loyalty flowed upward, not outward, how respect was expected from me, but not modeled toward me. And instead of reacting emotionally, I asked myself a different question. If this dynamic never changed, could I live with it long term? That question didn't demand an immediate answer, but it reframed everything. I began to see the wedding not just as a celebration, but as a signal, a public crystallization of private dynamics. How people treated me then would likely define how they treated me after. And I paid close attention to who checked in with me privately and who didn't. Some people did, quietly, without an agenda. Those moments mattered. They told me who saw me as a person, not a role. Others remained comfortable with assumptions, with narratives that benefited them, with my silence interpreted as agreement. I didn't correct them, because correction teaches people how to adjust just enough to maintain the system. Observation teaches you whether the system is worth staying in at all. By the time the wedding week arrived, I had learned more than anyone realized. I knew where I stood, I knew what I contributed, and I knew exactly how replaceable I was. To them, that knowledge didn't hurt. It clarified. What they never noticed was that I wasn't waiting for respect anymore. I was evaluating alignment. And once you start doing that, everything changes, quietly, decisively, and without needing permission. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where I gasped or felt triumphant. It came the way most truths do, quietly, once you finally stop looking away. It happened late one evening, a few days before the wedding. The apartment was still. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from work and last-minute errands. I sat at the dining table with my notebook open, the room lit by a single lamp. I wasn't searching for leverage. I wasn't plotting. I was simply reviewing finances, schedules, obligations, making sure everything was in order before a life transition that everyone said would change everything. And in the process of reviewing, I noticed something that had always been there. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was structural. There were assumptions baked into the marriage that had never been discussed out loud. Expectations about time, availability, support, especially toward his family, that were treated as natural extensions of being his wife, not requests, not negotiations, defaults. I traced those assumptions back through conversations, decisions, and phrasing. How often we had been used when the burden would land on me. How often were they framed as shared values when the labor was one-sided? And then I realized something else, something even quieter. I had more autonomy than anyone realized, not because I had hidden power, but because I had never surrendered it. I wasn't financially dependent. I wasn't legally entangled beyond what I consented to. I hadn't compromised my career, my savings, or my independence in the name of fitting in. They had mistaken my cooperation for compliance. That distinction mattered. The reveal wasn't about what I could do to them. It was about what I didn't owe them. I saw clearly that the role they had assigned me, the stabilizer, the absorber, the easy one, only worked if I continued to accept it. There was no mechanism forcing me to stay in it. No consequence for stepping back except disappointment. And disappointment, I realized, is not danger. I closed my notebook and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet of the apartment, to my own breathing, to the absence of urgency. I didn't feel empowered, I felt sober. Because clarity isn't exciting, it's grounding. I understood then that the wedding reception, the speeches, the public rituals, the family dynamics, was going to be a test. Not one I needed to pass, but one that would reveal everything. And whatever happened there would not be an isolated incident. It would be a signal of how visible I would be allowed to be in this family going forward. I didn't plan a response. I didn't rehearse anything. I didn't need to. What I had discovered was leverage of a different kind, choice. I could stay quiet and continue to be valued for my convenience, or I could allow the truth to surface and accept the consequences calmly. Either way, I would be intact. That was the reveal. Not that I could hurt anyone, but I could walk away from roles that required me to shrink. And once you know that, you don't need to rush. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to warn. You just wait and let people show you exactly how much respect they believe you deserve. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt steady. Not resolved, not tense, just clear. Whatever happened next wouldn't define me. It would define them. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with options. That's how I knew it was real. Urgency pressures you. Options reveal agency. The morning of the wedding, I woke before my alarm. The room was quiet, the light just beginning to slip through the curtains. I lay there for a moment, noticing how calm my body felt. No racing thoughts, no tight chest, just awareness. I knew that day would be symbolic. Not because of the ceremony itself, but because of what it would expose. I had already mapped out the possible paths. I could continue as I always had. Smile, absorb, deflect, let comments slide, allow public moments to rewrite private realities, maintain harmony at my own expense. I could confront things directly, correct people, challenge assumptions, draw lines in real time. That option existed. It would have been justified. But I knew what it would cost. Emotional escalation, defensiveness, denial, noise without resolution. Or I could choose the quietest option of all. I could let the truth appear without commentary. That option felt irreversible, because once you allow people to show you who they are publicly, you can't pretend you didn't see it, and neither can they. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, intimate, balanced. For a brief window, everything felt aligned. I allowed myself to be present there fully. That moment belonged to us. The reception was different. Families merge in public spaces. Hierarchies become visible. Micro decisions are made on the fly, often without reflection. I stayed observant. I noticed who spoke about our family without ever looking at me. I noticed how certain jokes were framed, whose comfort they prioritized, whose presence they assumed. And then it happened. During the reception, in front of friends, colleagues, and extended family, my in-laws made comments that were framed as humor, but landed as critique, about how I was lucky to be joining such a close-knit family, about how I'd need to adjust to their ways, about how patience and flexibility would be important, said with a smile that invited laughter. My in-laws criticized me during our wedding reception in front of everyone. The room responded the way rooms often do. Nervous laughter, polite smiles. No one is quite sure whether to lean in or look away. I felt the moment land. And I felt something else too, stillness. I didn't blush, I didn't freeze, I didn't respond. I met their eyes briefly, calmly, not defensively, and then I let the moment pass. That was the decision. I chose not to rescue the narrative. I chose not to soften it, not to explain, not to joke it away, not to correct it privately later, as if it hadn't happened publicly, because respect should have started on day one. And if it didn't, I wasn't going to manufacture it in real time. What I understood in that moment was this: any response I gave would teach them something. And the most honest lesson was silence. Silence that didn't apologize. Silence that didn't collapse. Silence that allowed discomfort to exist where it belonged. I saw the shift ripple outward, subtle, confused. Some guests glanced at me, checking for a reaction. Some looked down. Someone changed the subject too quickly. The system adjusted, awkwardly, and I stayed exactly where I was, present, composed, unmoved. That was the irreversible choice. Because once you allow disrespect to sit in the open without absorbing it, you change the dynamic permanently. You make it visible, you remove its protection. I didn't know yet what the consequences would be. I didn't need to. I knew only that I would not explain myself afterward. I would not negotiate dignity. I would not pretend it hadn't mattered. The decision wasn't to leave. It wasn't to fight. It was to remember. And from that point on, everything that followed was already in motion. After the reception ended, life didn't pause the way people expect it to after a symbolic moment. There was no immediate fallout, no confrontation, no apology, no dramatic shift in tone, which told me everything I needed to know. Disrespect, when unchallenged publicly, is often quietly archived by the people who benefit from it. It becomes something that happened, not something to be addressed. And because I didn't react the way they anticipated, didn't laugh it off, didn't protest, didn't seek reassurance, the moment remained unresolved. That unresolved space was where I moved. I didn't bring it up on our wedding night. I didn't rehash it on the honeymoon. I didn't ask my husband to defend me or interpret it for me. I let the memory sit exactly as it was, unaltered, unsoftened. Instead, I focused on logistics. Marriage changes the way systems interact, financially, legally, socially. I made sure I understood every change before it happened. I reviewed documents carefully. I asked neutral questions. I clarified expectations without framing them as emotional concerns. When my husband talked about future plans that involved his family, holidays, obligations, shared responsibilities, I listened closely. Not to argue, but to understand the assumptions beneath his words. And when those assumptions included me by default, I didn't immediately agree. I asked follow-up questions. How often? What does that look like in practice? Who usually handles that? I asked them calmly, without accusation, without defensiveness. At first he answered easily, then occasionally he paused. Those pauses mattered. They were the first signs that the system was being examined instead of assumed. I also adjusted my availability. I didn't cancel plans. I didn't withdraw. I simply stopped rearranging my life to accommodate last-minute expectations. When something conflicted, I said so, briefly. No explanations, no guilt. I already have plans. That won't work for me. Let me think about it. Each sentence was simple, neutral, final. No one pushed back directly. They simply adjusted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes reluctantly. And still, no one mentioned the reception, which confirmed what I already knew. If I wanted accountability, I would not get it through confrontation. I would get it through consistency. I continued documenting, not obsessively, just clearly. Conversations, decisions, patterns. Not because I expected to use them, but because clarity requires memory. Emotion fades, records don't. I noticed how often the phrase family expectations was used as a justification. And I noticed how rarely those expectations were reciprocal. So I stopped treating them as fixed. I treated them as proposals. And like any proposal, they were subject to review. What surprised me most was how calm I felt throughout all of this. There was no anger fueling my actions, no desire to prove a point, just alignment. Moving in silence doesn't mean secrecy. It means restraint. It means choosing not to announce internal decisions before they're complete. By the time anyone realized I was no longer automatically available, the change had already settled. They didn't confront me because there was nothing concrete to confront. I hadn't refused family. I hadn't criticized anyone. I hadn't changed my personality. I had simply stopped overfunctioning. And systems that rely on overfunctioning don't collapse loudly. They strain quietly. That strain showed up in small ways. Plans took longer. Decisions required more discussion. Emotional labor had to be redistributed. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was noticeable. And I stayed steady through it. Because the truth was, I wasn't moving against anyone. I was moving toward myself. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as an absence. At first, it was subtle. A shift in tone, a delay in communication. Invitations that felt more formal, less assumed, not withdrawn, just altered. I noticed how often people reached out to my husband directly now, instead of looping me in automatically. How plans were discussed without my name being used as shorthand for agreement. how my silence at the reception seemed to have created a quiet uncertainty they hadn't resolved. That uncertainty did something interesting. It made them cautious. Without my usual reassurance, people hesitated. They double-checked. They asked clarifying questions they hadn't needed before. And when they didn't, the results weren't as smooth. I wasn't stepping in to correct course anymore. For a while, I think they assumed this was temporary. A phase, a natural adjustment period after a wedding. They waited for me to return to my role. I didn't. And slowly, the cost of that absence became visible. Family gatherings required more coordination. Misunderstandings lingered longer. Emotional tension wasn't diffused as quickly. Not because I caused any of it, but because I wasn't absorbing it. I could feel the shift in how I was perceived. I was no longer easy. I was quiet, then reserved, then occasionally hard to read. Those labels weren't complaints. They were observations, signs that the old narrative no longer fit. My husband felt it too, though he didn't name it right away. He mentioned feeling more pressure during family interactions, more responsibility to manage expectations, to mediate. For the first time, he experienced what I had been doing quietly all along, and that changed how he listened. One evening, weeks after the wedding, he asked me, carefully, how I'd felt about the reception. I didn't rush to answer. When I spoke, I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I described the moment as it happened, the words, the setting, the lack of response, and then I stopped. I didn't tell him how to feel about it. I didn't demand validation. I let the reality stand on its own. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't realize it landed like that, he said eventually. I believed him. But I also understood something important. Realization doesn't undo impact. What followed wasn't an apology tour or a sudden shift in family behavior. It was more gradual, more uncomfortable. Some family members became distant, polite, but less warm. Others tested boundaries lightly, small comments, casual assumptions, to see if I'd resume my old role. I didn't. I stayed consistent, kind, neutral, present, but no longer available by default. That consistency created friction, not overt conflict, but discomfort. And discomfort often reveals where respect was missing. I noticed who adapted and who resented the change, who made an effort to engage with me directly, and who withdrew when they realized I wasn't going to carry the emotional load for them. Those responses were informative. What mattered most was how I felt. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt grounded. There was a clarity in knowing that the peace I had previously maintained came at a cost, and that I was no longer paying it alone. The consequences weren't dramatic, but they were irreversible. Once you stop compensating, people either step up or step away. And either outcome tells you everything you need to know. By the time anyone tried to fix things, the window for easy repair had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the underlying assumption that things could simply return to how they were was no longer true. The first attempt came disguised as concern. My mother-in-law invited me to lunch, just the two of us. Her tone was warm, almost nostalgic. She spoke about how busy things had been, how families sometimes miscommunicate, how she hoped everything felt settled now that the wedding was over. I listened carefully. What she didn't mention was the reception. What she didn't acknowledge was the public nature of the comments. What she didn't ask was how I had experienced any of it. The conversation was framed as maintenance, not accountability. When she finally paused, clearly expecting reassurance, I offered something honest, but limited. I'm comfortable with where things are right now, I said. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. She looked momentarily confused. Then I smiled and nodded, as if I'd said something agreeable. But the air had shifted. After that, the approaches became less subtle. A comment here, a gentle joke there, a reference to how close we used to be. None of it addressed the core issue. It all circled it, carefully, politely, hoping proximity would substitute for acknowledgement. I didn't fill in the gap, because what they wanted wasn't resolution. It was a restoration. And restoration would have required me to resume my old role. I didn't. At some point, frustration surfaced. Not openly, through tone, through impatience, through the way certain family members spoke around me instead of to me. I noticed it without reacting. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't withholding forgiveness. I wasn't holding on to anger. I had simply recalibrated my expectations. I no longer expected to be prioritized by people who had shown me I wasn't, and I no longer overextended myself to maintain appearances. That recalibration felt like distance to them, To me, it felt like accuracy. My husband struggled during this phase. He wanted harmony. He wanted everyone to feel okay again. He asked me once what it would take to move forward. Move. I answered truthfully. Respect should have started on day one, I said. I can't build it retroactively for other people. That wasn't a threat. It wasn't final. It was an explanation. He understood slowly that what was lost wasn't a relationship, it was an illusion. The illusion that everything had been fine simply because I hadn't said otherwise. Once that illusion broke, there was no going back to unspoken agreements. There were conversations that never happened because they would have required humility instead of politeness. There were apologies that were hinted at but never fully offered. And eventually there was acceptance. Not reconciliation, not resolution. Just an unspoken understanding that the dynamic had changed and that it wasn't going to be reset by nostalgia or good intentions. Too late doesn't mean impossible, it means costly. And not everyone is willing to pay that cost. I was. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointing in its quietness. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, no audience. It happened during a family gathering months later. One of those events where everyone pretends nothing is wrong while carefully navigating what has changed. At some point in the evening, my father-in-law asked if we could talk privately. His tone was neutral, controlled, not unkind. We stepped into a quieter room. The door remained open. I feel like there's been some distance, he said, not accusing, observational. I want to understand what happened. I nodded. I appreciated the directness. I didn't start with the reception. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every moment that had accumulated over time. I chose precision. There were moments, I said, where decisions and comments about me were made publicly without regard for how they might land. I didn't address them at the time, but I noticed. He listened. His expression didn't change much. If something upset you, he said, you could have said so. I agreed with him. I could have, I said, and I chose not to. That seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation would have. I explained calmly that I had spent a long time being flexible, accommodating, and easy to work with, that I had done so willingly, and that at some point I realized that flexibility had been mistaken for permission. I'm not angry, I said, but I am more deliberate now. There was a pause. He asked what I wanted. I answered honestly. I want interactions that don't require me to minimize myself to keep things smooth. No demands, no ultimatums. Just clarity. He nodded slowly. I don't know if he fully understood, but I know he heard me. When we returned to the group, nothing looked different, but something had shifted. From then on, conversations with him were more careful, more direct, less assumptive. Not warm, but respectful. That was enough. Not every confrontation ends in closeness. Some end in recalibration. And recalibration, when done without heat, lasts longer. Who I am now is not louder than who I was before. If anything, I speak less. But I no longer disappear inside that silence. The version of me that existed before the wedding believed that patience was the same as strength, that endurance would naturally lead to respect, that if I stayed calm long enough, people would eventually meet me there. What I know now is different. Calm is not a substitute for boundaries. Kindness is not a contract. And being easy to live with should never require being difficult to know. I didn't become hardened by what happened. I became specific. I know where I stand in rooms now. I don't scan faces for approval. I don't pre-adjust myself to fit expectations that were never negotiated. I let pauses exist. I let people finish their thoughts without rushing to soften them. If someone speaks for me, I correct it, briefly. If someone assumes my agreement, I clarify, calmly. If someone oversteps, I don't over-explain why it matters. That doesn't make me confrontational, it makes me accurate. My relationship with my husband is stronger for it, not because everything is perfect, but because it's honest. He understands now what emotional labor looks like when it's invisible. He sees the difference between peace that's shared and peace that's outsourced. As for his family, the dynamic is quieter, more contained. I'm no longer central to its functioning. And that's intentional. I attend when I want to, I contribute when it's reciprocal. I opt out without guilt when it's not. There's no tension in that, just alignment. What surprises people sometimes is that I'm still kind, still composed, still thoughtful. They expect boundaries to come with sharp edges. Mine don't. They come with clarity. I don't need to be liked by everyone in the room. I don't need to be indispensable. I don't need to be praised for my flexibility. I need to be respected. And if that respect isn't available, I don't negotiate. I adjust my proximity. That's the difference. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about self-trust, about knowing when to engage and when to step back, about recognizing that your presence has weight and choosing where to place it. I didn't lose anything by changing, I gained accuracy. I gained the ability to stand in public moments without shrinking, to let discomfort exist without rushing to fix it, to walk away from roles that require my silence as payment. Who I am now is someone who understands that respect should have started on day one, but also that it's never too late to stop accepting less. There's a particular kind of relief that comes when you stop asking, "What could I have done differently?" and start asking, "What did this teach me?" For a long time, I believed that harmony was something you earned by being agreeable, that if you stayed calm, flexible, and understanding, respect would eventually follow. What this experience taught me is that harmony without mutual regard is just silence doing all the work. When my in-laws criticized me during our wedding reception, the moment itself wasn't what changed me. It was what the moment revealed. Not just about them, but about me. About how often I had allowed my composure to be mistaken for consent. How often I had let others define the terms of respect because I didn't want to disrupt the room. There is nothing noble about enduring what slowly erodes you. And there is nothing cruel about stepping back when dignity requires it. The moral of this story isn't that you should confront every slight or demand apologies from people who may never understand. It's that you don't owe anyone your silence in exchange for belonging. Respect is not something you earn by being convenient. It's something that begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep things smooth. Quiet dominance doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't seek revenge. It observes, it remembers, and it chooses differently next time. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you've ever been the one who understood, who didn't mind, who kept things together, I want you to hear this clearly. Your calm is not an invitation to be overlooked. You are allowed to let pauses exist. You're allowed to stop explaining yourself. You're allowed to move your energy away from places that require you to shrink. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you stop reacting and start aligning. And sometimes the most honest response to public disrespect is not a defense, but a decision. Before we close, I want to leave you with one question. Not to provoke, but to reflect. Have you ever stayed quiet in a moment because you thought it was easier, only to realize later that it taught people exactly how to treat you? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.